This is Charlie Rose.
Welcome to the broadcast. We come to you live this evening. Today there was a major terrorist attack on the country. As many of you know, it began this morning at 8:45 a.m. 4 planes were hijacked. 2 of them crashed into the World Trade Center. A 3rd plane crashed into the Pentagon. A 4th crashed in Somerset, Pennsylvania. Here are some scenes of these events, courtesy of CNN.
Began just before 9 a.m. American Flight 11 from Boston to Los Angeles crashed into one of the twin towers of the World Trade Center. Then, 10 minutes later, the 2nd plane, a United flight also from Boston to Los Angeles, crashed into the 2nd tower. The twin towers, a symbol of American economic power, stood wounded in the morning sky. Then, they stood no more.
Today is obviously one of the most difficult days in the history of the city and the country. The tragedy that we're all undergoing right now is something that we've had nightmares about, but probably thought wouldn't happen.
Clearly, this is an attack upon America. It's an attack upon our freedom and our way of life, and we must retaliate and go after those who perpetuated this heinous crime against the people of America.
President George Bush, who was in Florida, returned to Washington later this afternoon and addressed the nation tonight.
The pictures of airplanes flying into buildings, fires burning, huge structures collapsing, have filled us with disbelief, terrible sadness, and a quiet, unyielding anger. These acts of mass murder were intended to frighten our nation into chaos and retreat. But they have failed. Our country is strong. A great people has been moved to defend a great nation. Terrorist attacks can shake the foundations of our biggest buildings, but they cannot touch the foundation of America. These acts shatter steel, but they cannot dent the steel of American resolve. America was targeted for attack because we're the brightest beacon for freedom and opportunity in the world, and no one will keep that light from shining. Today, our nation saw evil, the very worst of human nature, and we responded with the best of America.
This is the gravest terrorist attack on the United States since Pearl Harbor, a date President Roosevelt described as one which will live in infamy. This date may be remembered for a long time as well. Many people have predicted a terrorist attack inside the United States, but everyone was surprised by the extent of what happened today. Tonight, the concerns of Americans and many around the world is for the victims and their families. There are more questions this evening than there are answers. Questions such as how many casualties, who did it, how will the United States respond, and what will this event do to the nature of American life? Joining us this evening for this live broadcast are a distinguished group of public officials and journalists. They include General Wesley Clark from Little Rock, Arkansas, former UN Ambassador Richard Holbrooke here in New York, former National Security Advisor to President Clinton Samuel Berger here in New York, General Ephraim Snee of Israel, who was Deputy Defense Minister under Prime Minister Barak and is now Minister of Transportation in the Unity Government of Israel. Also here, Judith Miller from the New York Times, author of Germ, America's Secret War Against Biological Weapons. And from Washington, Democratic Senator John Edwards of North Carolina joins us later, and Steve Emerson, a terrorist analyst and investigator. I am pleased to have each of them here. Tom Clancy will join us also, the novelist, by phone later. I begin, however, from Little Rock with General Clark. General Clark, can you hear me?
Yes, I can, Charlie.
Tell me what questions that are foremost in your mind as a military man, a man who has served your nation around the globe.
Well, we know something about the terrorist network that's out there, but do we know enough? We know that it's composed of hundreds of individuals in dozens of different shadowy organizations that are interrelated. We know they've got base areas in various places. We know that there was a lot of cooperation and work together to pull this attack off, and yet we didn't get any advance warning, apparently, of it. We couldn't break it up. We've got to build a consensus, and then we've got to go after this terrorist organization. Now, just continue for a moment with the Pearl Harbor analogy that's been at the forefront of American minds today. If it is a Pearl Harbor, then Americans are going to be asked to sacrifice to do something about this. And there'll be sacrifices imposed on us, there's no doubt about it. But it's also going to be a relatively long-term struggle. This is not something that's going to be taken care of by a couple of cruise missile strikes. We're going to have to go after these organizations and the nations that support them and the government officials in those nations that support them. We're going to have to root it out. It's going to be difficult. It's going to be risky. And we're going to have to take risks with the American personnel who are on the front lines carrying out the action. And so, as a military man, I'd be looking for the intelligence information. And I'd be looking for the national resolve and the support of the American people, and then I'd be looking for the guidance from the Commander-in-Chief to get on with the task.
All right, I want to come back to you, but let me go to General Snee. General Clark, let me do this first with you, General Clark, and go around the table. There seems to be a majority opinion that this was the work of Osama bin Laden. Do you accept that? Do you think that's likely? And is he the person most capable of doing this?
Well, he, as far as we know, he's the person most capable of doing it, but there could be state sponsors as well. He's got a large organization, and it operates through several different fronts, and so it's not right to focus on one individual. This is an organization, probably several organizations, and maybe more than one state who are engaged in supporting it. So we've got to take action on a broad front.
Sandy Berger, you sat in the National Security Council and talked about and thought about acts like this. I remember asking the president in the White House, did he expect a terrorist attack, and he said he thought one would come, even though he didn't know when or where or in what manner, and I'm certainly even the president would be surprised, being President Clinton. How do you feel about the likelihood that this was Osama bin Laden, and what kind of decision-making is going on in the White House tonight?
Well, we don't know, and I think we have to be careful to not leap to a firm conclusion. Certainly he is the leading suspect in terms of intent and capability. But we also have to recognize, Charlie, that this is a watershed event. This is a major escalation of the terrorist assault against the United States, both in terms of capability and in terms of malevolent intent. And therefore, it calls upon us to, as General Clark said, once we determine responsibility, and I think that will happen relatively quickly. I think there are enough pieces here that will put this together relatively quickly. It will require a sustained, concerted, long-term effort. There's no silver bullet here, no single act. This is not simply a question of retaliation. This has to be a question of ultimately disruption and taking down a very complex terrorist network. And each act in and of itself of doing that will have its own consequences. So I think we have to support the president, but I think that we have to, in a sense, buckle our seatbelts as a people, because I think we're in for a very long ride, and I think we have the will to do that. But it is not a simple act, as General Clark said, of launching cruise missiles from 1,000 miles away from Afghanistan, if that's in fact the responsibility lies.
In other words, American service people will have to make sacrifices in order to seek out whoever did this.
I think there will be a comprehensive response here, which will involve, will first of all necessarily involve a stepped-up effort of our allies. This is not just an attack on the United States today. This is an attack on the democratic world, on the civilized world, and we have to be joined here and expect to be joined here by our allies in Europe, by the Russians, who I think will be have been targeted and victimed of terrorism, and by our friends and allies in the moderate Arab nations in the Middle East. So we have to have a concerted effort here, and the will for a long-term struggle in a new phase of a terrorist war.
When you talk about that, Richard, I've listened to you today and other appearances talk about building this kind of coalition with Russia, with China, to do what, other than to agree on some war against terrorism? Is this kind of a Gulf War type of coalition to go after those responsible?
It's going to be tougher than the Gulf Coalition because of the amorphous nature of who perpetrated this act. The most important sentence in President Bush's speech a few hours ago was when he said there'd be no difference for the United States government between those who committed the act and those who harbored, sheltered, or condoned those who committed it. And that's key. Let's assume for a minute, as we all are, that it was Osama bin Laden. Then the Taliban, which is already trying to disengage by saying they had nothing to do with it, are going to also have to share the responsibility. For the United States, as the leader of the world, we are now being put to a supreme test, and all Americans should back the administration as it forms the coalition. Now, to your question, Charlie. To form a coalition with the Europeans is relatively easy in this situation. The Russians will say the right things. How much they'll do, we'll see. The Chinese are going to be leaning in our direction, but they'll hedge a bit. Now we get to the really tricky one, which is the states in the Middle East. The moderate Arabs, Egypt, Jordan, some of the others, are going to be in a very difficult position here, but they must now be put to the test as well. The U.S. gives huge amounts of aid to some of these countries. Others are strategically important to us because of oil or location. And without them joining a coalition against this terror, the kind of objectives which we all seek and which Sandy just discussed as being essential and Wes Clark are going to be even harder to achieve.
Okay, my point, though, I assume, and I think you're both, everyone is saying this is not just another summit on terrorism. This is a coalition to do something.
Look, we've talked about the Pearl Harbor analogy all day long for a reason. The death toll is going to be higher than the 2,230 people who died at Pearl Harbor, and they are civilians doing their work, not even in uniform. And we are, as Sandy said, in a new world today. The rules are going to have to change a bit, and we're going to have to lead that effort in the international community.
Let me go ahead. I want to come back to General Clark and then General Snake.
I think the fundamental point the American people need to understand is that once we determine who's responsible, this will not be dealt with in one swift and punishing retaliation. This will require a coordinated long-term strategy that involves economic pressure, political pressure, and presumably military action. And simply trying to strike at a target from 1,000 miles away will not, as General Clark said, root out the fundamental problem here. And I think
what's the fundamental problem?
There is a
General Clark, I'm coming back to you as well.
All right, good.
Again, we're making some assumptions here in terms of this discussion, but there is a pernicious terrorist network around the world. It's more than a few hundred people, as General Clark said. It's hundreds of thousands of people in various organizations, the center of gravity of which, in a sense, lies with bin Laden. The fulcrum, in a sense, lies with bin Laden. But we'll have to take these cells down country by country with the cooperation of other intelligence communities. And in terms of Afghanistan itself, as Judy knows, who's been up through those mountains, that's rough terrain and not an easy task.
Tell me what might be the intent of Osama bin Laden or someone else, and when we say state-sponsored terrorism, what country is likely to be in alliance with Osama bin Laden or giving him aid and comfort other than the Taliban in Afghanistan?
Well, I think if it turns out to be bin Laden, as we're all saying, I think we have to focus on these networks. And I'm worried about the war here at home, the war on terrorism at home. You have some 5,000 militants who have passed through the 12 camps that Osama bin Laden personally controls and finances in Afghanistan. There are approximately 50 to 70,000 Muslim militants who spent some time in camps in Afghanistan who are affiliated with other militant groups that he also recruits from. So the scale of this war is going to be large, and as Sandy and Dick said, it has to be sustained. And I don't think that we've even begun to understand the depth of the problem here, where sleeper agents have been sent to this country where they have been assuming ordinary jobs, appearing to be ordinary people, and who are activated when the moment comes. We've seen this MO again and again with bin Laden's networks. It's not enough to get him. It's not enough to get the men around him, the 4 or 5. You really have to root out terrorism in each and every country, and I just find that an awesomely difficult challenge.
General Snee, I want to come to you, but is that what, General Clark, speak to the challenge of doing that if you're not just talking about one man in one camp in Afghanistan?
Well, as everyone has said, this is a large network. So picture a dozen or 2 dozen countries, each of which have cells of 50 to 75 people in a half dozen different locations. And they're connected. They're getting information. Someone's providing them passports. They have jobs. They have couriers. They're in some sort of covert training from time to time. That means that you have to share intelligence. You have to go to that country's police and interior ministry and you say, here's what we know. And they say, but he hasn't broken any law in our country. What can we do about him? And you say, here's as much evidence as we can give you. And there's this long, prolonged debate as people grapple with how much information can be given away and can we trust the Interior Ministry in country X to handle the situation correctly. And then if they take him in, will we be able to interrogate, or will they insist they do the questioning and then we won't get the information? And how much can nations really trust? It's about information first, and then it comes to action. Who's capable of taking the action to take down these cells? What if there's resistance? What if they cross borders?
Well, then answer that question. Who is capable? Is that the U.S. military and some coalition, or is it?
It is the U.S. military, but it's other militaries as well. But we don't like to operate in coalitions with these very small organizations. They're elite, they're specially trained. They operate by habit, instinct, and prolonged training, and they all speak the same language. They have the same drills on our team. The other teams are the same, and so you can't combine them easily. So this makes it difficult to share risks. So there are many things about operating in a coalition like this that are far different from the Gulf War coalition, in addition to which it's going to take much longer. We're talking about law, information, eavesdropping, as well as special operations. And in the information age, information like this is it's like gold bullion in the age of mercantilism. Governments don't like to share it. Governments don't like to admit they have it. This is going to be a very difficult challenge. It's going to take enormous leadership from the United States and enormous courage from many countries, as Dick Holbrooke said, especially the moderate Arab states, who are going to have to put, to some degree, their control on the line. They're going to have to confront certain elements in the Arab streets in their countries.
You think they'll be willing to do that? You think they're prepared to do that in Egypt?
I think the United States is going to have to work with these countries. Yes, we're going to have to help them, because without their support, we can't truly deal with this problem.
General Snee, you know more about having been on the front line against terrorism than most of us. Tell me what you think the United States has to do and what ought it do in response to this kind of attack.
You know, I'm not in a position to give operative recommendations. It's the task of the leadership of the United States. But I can say what are our lessons.
All right.
As you know, we cope with state-sponsored terrorism of this kind, of suicide bombing, for several years. And the methods that we adopted as surgical operations against those who mastermind and organize the terrorist operation, this is the most effective way. We use it by combination of high-quality intelligence, precisely guided ammunition, airstrikes, and special forces. This is the most effective way. Again, I can speak about our experience. It works. We succeed to foil great number, a great part of the attacks that are planned on Israel. Many of them we succeed to prevent. And this operation, this terrorist murderous operation which occurred today, could not be carried out without a support of a state. And one of the
What state was it?
I don't know yet.
But the name we hear bandied about more today has been Iraq.
There is a club. There is a club of three countries. Yeah. It's not very much of them. There are not very many of them. Not to stop the appeasing policy towards the rogue states. It's about time to stop the gentle appeasing attitude towards Iran, Iraq, Afghanistan. It's enough.
You said, as we sat down, that this was probably a long time in planning. Long time means what?
Certainly weeks, probably months. What is staggering about this operation is the fact that it was conducted within the United States, which indicates a capability to operate in the United States which exceeds, I think, what the intelligence community has understood to be present here. We've known there are operatives, sleeper cells, as Judy said. There's been surveillance of them, but dozens of people were involved in this. It is months in the execution. These were not only suicide bombers, these were commercial pilots. I don't believe that those American pilots or our American pilots took those planes into that into that World Trade Center. So you have to find the profile of someone who is willing to be a suicide bomber, of which there are unfortunately a fairly large reservoir, but also someone who can fly a 767, not something easy to do. This is a long time in planning and a fair amount of operation going on within the United States without detection.
Okay, let me ask, General Clark, you've got to go. I want to ask this one question. Do you consider this an act of war?
I certainly do. But and if I could, just to follow up for a second on
I'm going to lose you in a minute, and so I've got to go
on what Sandy said, there are other acts in preparation. We can be sure of that. This is not the only shoe that will fall.
In the next 24 hours, 48 hours?
Well, we don't know. But we know that this is a large network, and they won't have planned only one set of acts. And that's something else we have to be mindful of as we're going about taking down this organization. There is an urgency to it.
Thank you for joining us tonight. Thanks to Walter Isaacson and CNN for allowing you to pull you away from CNN to appear on this broadcast. And I thank you very much.
Thank you, Charlie.
What's the risk for the President and the challenge for the President and his leadership at this time?
First of all, any president in this situation has to show the kind of national leadership from the bully pulpit of the presidency, which FDR showed on December 7th and 8th, 1941. It takes great presidential leadership to rally a country. I might add, before I get to the second part of my answer, that the people of New York City have certainly shown leadership today on an individual basis. Long lines around the blood banks, a spirit of common shared
courage
and heroism. No looting. It's been another remarkable tribute to this city, which is in a state of shock tonight, and the loss of life here is going to be much bigger than Pearl Harbor. The second thing the administration and the President must do is to come up with a immediate solution to whatever allowed this to happen. Let's start with the fact 4 planes simultaneously were taken over. There was obviously a fatal flaw in airport airline security, which the people who did this understood and exploited very, very well. And I agree with Wes Clark that one has to assume that having done this, they may have another shoe to drop, and there's going to have to be precautions. Secretary Norm Mineta, Transportation Secretary, your American counterpart, General, is said tonight he will decide tomorrow when to resume flights. The U.S. cannot remain paralyzed. Its economic, psychological, and political will must be reasserted, but he can't resume the flights if there's a chance this is going to continue. So there are some very tough technical decisions that must be made in the absence of sufficient knowledge. The third thing is international, and as everyone on your panel tonight has agreed, Charlie, it's going to take a long time to successfully turn the tide here. And since we're always talking about Pearl Harbor, let's remember that the setback lasted 6 months, and the turnaround was decisive from June of 1942 on, and we never stopped winning after that. But to be very clear here, this international coalition that we've all talked about is not easy to build, particularly among countries like Egypt and Jordan. We have simultaneously, Israel is facing the greatest threat to its security and safety, in my view, since 1947-48. I, of course, would defer to the general on the historical analogy, but we can all agree that Israel has to be on redoubled vigilance tonight, and we're going to have to be ready for a crisis in which the Mideast situation and our own domestic problems converge into one enormous challenge. And the risk of a backlash, if it's mishandled, will be great.
Are you surprised no one's taking credit, Judy? Are you surprised no one's taking credit for this?
One of the reasons I think that this may point to the Osama bin Laden networks is precisely because nobody has taken credit. His groups don't take credit.
They didn't take credit for Kenya. They didn't take credit for the coal.
And as Sandy pointed out, he said weeks, months in preparations. I would argue perhaps even years. When you look at the bombing of the American embassies in Africa, we saw that one of the first scouts was sent to Nairobi to scout out a target in 1993. Well, that was 5 years before the actual bombing of those embassies took place. So we're dealing with a very sophisticated operation
here. They went after the same building 8 years ago.
Exactly. And who knows, now it begins to look as if the first attack on the World Trade Center might also have been connected to an Osama bin Laden predecessor organization.
Jonathan,
we have another example. Twice, in 92 and in 94, there were explosions in Buenos Aires. Once in the Jewish Community Center and the other in the Israeli Embassy in Buenos Aires. And till today, no one claimed responsibility. We know that a branch of Hezbollah did it, but they didn't claim responsibility till today.
But, you know, they have declared a war. I mean, they openly declared war in a fatwa, a religious edict, in February of 1998. And Osama bin Laden, yes, Osama bin Laden and his allies in a camp in Khost in Afghanistan declared a war against American soldiers and civilians and called upon every believing Muslim to kill Americans wherever they may be.
Should I accept it as fact that if the United States, knowing what it knew, assuming as we're making the assumption, which seems to be the consensus around the country and in all the things that I've seen today, that Osama bin Laden was involved, do I also make the assumption that if the United States could have found him and could have gotten him, they would have? You had 8 years in Washington.
Yeah. I think the answer to that is yes.
So why should we think we can now?
It is extremely difficult to have what is called actionable intelligence. That is, not only knowing where someone is, but where someone will be 1,000 miles from the nearest body of international water. And so there were points during the Clinton administration where we had intelligence on where he was, where he had been, but never sufficient intelligence as to where he would be for the military to recommend an action, except in the one instance after the bombing in Egypt, when we had information that there would be a gathering of bin Laden operatives, perhaps including bin Laden. And we took action. It turned out the timing was off.
I want to do one thing. Tom Clancy, are you there?
Sir.
Much has been made today about the fact that this is the kind of thing that you might write about. I don't want to address that question, but just give me your sense of what surprises you about this event today.
What surprises me is the fact that whoever planned this operation was able to locate and employ 4 people who are willing to cast their lives away.
Why does that surprise you, Tom, when it happens? It happens a lot now in the Middle East.
Not 4 at once, and you know it's the most unusual thing for any criminal to throw his life away. Criminals are not by nature courageous people. and to throw your life away, while it may be fanatical, generally fulfills the definition of courageous.
Yeah, but not if you think
And
you're
one
going
other thing
somewhere better.
I'd like to say, if I might, if you'll excuse me, somebody I can't see on TV. So somebody said earlier that where do you get 4 airline pilots to do this? Well, they weren't pilots. Actually, flying the airplane into the targets was a relatively simple operation. Oddly enough, it's something I've sort of done myself with an Air Force flight simulator. At Dover Air Force Base, once upon a time, I played with a C-5 simulator. And one of the things we did was to fly through simulated buildings just to see what would happen to the simulator.
But it's not
So the hard part of flying an airplane is taking off and landing. Actually, flying it through the air is fairly simple. So what these guys did to drive it into buildings was not terribly demanding.
All right, but listen to what this is. Sandy Berger, National Security Advisor. Sandy.
Yes, sir.
Tom, I think the point here that I'm making, this is not the profile of the 17-year-old young fanatic
with a bomb
which
strapped to his chest.
General Snee is unfortunately all too
Well,
familiar with.
Unfortunately, Mr. Berger, we just don't know yet. It could have been an 18-year-old kid who walked aboard with a yo-yo and looked harmless to the security people at the airport. We just don't know.
Well, what we do know is that in previous Osama bin Laden network attacks, the people who helped carry them out were oftentimes very well educated, middle-class people who had gone to college, who were electrical engineers or who were pilots. We know that there are at least 3 pilots who worked for bin Laden's organization. And I think the image that we all have and that General Snee is familiar with of the rabid militants standing on a street corner screaming death to America, this is not the kind of people we're dealing with, and that's another problem that
Again, ma'am, that may be true, but this is entirely speculative on this.
Absolutely. We don't know yet.
Osama bin Laden is like Claude Rains in Casablanca saying, round up the usual suspects. He's simply the usual suspect. But there has been no definitive information linking him to this event. Until there is talking about him, it's just a waste of air.
Well, the New York Times is reporting tonight.
That's
and
nice.
Senator Orrin Hatch said today that there was some information pointing to communications, electronic communications, pointing to Osama bin Laden's people.
Do you have reason, Tom, you're suggesting that there's no evidence, but do you have reason to believe, based on your conversations, that this is not the work of Osama bin Laden?
There's no reason to believe that it is. I mean, you don't just line somebody up against a wall and shoot him because you don't like him. I grant you he's maybe a very disagreeable person, but until we know he is the criminal in this case, you don't shoot him.
Okay, but I mean,
otherwise you risk wasting a bullet on the wrong person, which doesn't do anybody any good.
Yeah. On the other hand, there's the notion if you hear hoofbeats, expect a horse.
Well, there's lots of different kinds of horses, Charlie.
All right, stay with me. John Edwards has joined us, Senator from North Carolina, Democrat in the Senate. Senator Edwards, tell me the mood in Washington and the feeling for what senators and Congress people might want the president to say and to do. I mean, is there a sense of what kind of resolution the Congress might be called on by its leadership to pass tomorrow?
Well, Charlie, I think what happened is the mood in Washington changed over the course of the day. I just dropped my 3-year-old off at daycare and was on my way to the office this morning when the first airplane hit the first tower of the World Trade Center. I got a phone call in my car. And then when I arrived in my office, and I think this was the prevailing mood at the time, there were just lots of questions. What's happening? How is this possible? And I think as the realization occurred that among all of us that what we were seeing on television was in fact reality, that these events were actually occurring. Over the course of the day, I think the mood changed. It went from questioning, then to disbelief, then to acceptance that in fact these things had happened. And I think over the course of the day, a very strong feeling of resolution that we were going to be deliberative about this, but that deliberation was backed up by a feeling of anger, that this was something that was an attack on our nation, that our people were dying, that something was going to have to be done about it. And I think by this afternoon, when a bunch of senators met to talk with our leadership around 5 o'clock this afternoon, I would describe the prevailing feeling in that room, and there must have been 50 to 75 senators present, as one of quiet anger. There were a lot of people who were mad We're mad about what had happened, but we're thoughtful and deliberative about the process of what the next step needed to be.
All right. Let me ask this question of everyone here, including Tom. Does this day change America in some way? Are things going to be different for this country from now on out? General Snee, you've experienced more of this. People in Israel tell me because of attacks there, that the whole country's on edge. Now, this is one series of events on one day. Another shoe may fall, as some have suggested here, but does something change?
It seems to me that America today knows for one day what we experienced for several years. The feeling that there is no safe place, that a shopping mall, a restaurant, a bus station, a railway station may turn in a moment to a target of a suicide bomber. This feeling prevails today in the United States, and I know that it takes a great deal of resolve and spiritual forces to stand against such reality if it takes a long time. I would like to refer to one professional point that you made. We discuss a lot who did it. Nobody knows. One thing is very clear. A very serious, concerted intelligence effort is needed now to know who behind it, who sponsors it, and it takes a very sincere and professional cooperation of the intelligence organizations of all the Western democracies.
Charlie.
Okay, that raises an interesting question. Go ahead.
I want to, I'm sure everyone will agree with this. This is an enormously strong and resilient country which has faced challenges of monumental proportions before. The world now is watching us as to how we will respond to this. There should be no question, number one, that everyone will be united behind the president. There should be no question, number two, of our resoluteness. But while I think the landscape of international terrorism has changed, we cannot let this corrode the fabric of American society, or the people who did that today prevail. And so while there are a whole series of things that have to be done in terms of security, in terms of precaution, in terms of intelligence, in terms of a strategy for dealing with this, we cannot let fear become the dominant, self-fulfilling prophecy here, which dictates how we live.
But it also demands, I would assume.
If I can jump in at this point,
It also,
Charlie,
go ahead. Who is that?
This is Clancy. I'd like to agree
go ahead,
completely with the last statement. The thing we have to keep in mind is the terrorist is a political actor performing on a political stage. His objective is to cause political change in his target. We are the target at the moment. If we change our society, the terrorist wins. If we tell the terrorist we are who we are and what we choose to be, and you can't change that fella, then we win.
But so therefore, Tom, what kind of response do you think is demanded in order to make that statement to whoever did this act?
Identify the target, locate the target, engage the target, destroy the target, and live our lives the way we choose to be. Remain the United States of America.
All right, well, let me make that a specific. Let's assume this is someone like Osama bin Laden or Osama bin Laden, and they're being protected by a government of another country. What do you think we do? Do we go to that country and demand that they turn over somebody or some group of people, or we will issue an ultimatum that the United States military will come in with full force?
The most important thing the president said tonight was, when he said that whoever shelters these people is to us the same as the people we are hunting.
Right, you've said that.
Now, that means we find out that Slovenia is sheltering these terrorists. We call the president of Slovenia. We tell him politely, one time, don't do that or something really bad's going to happen. If he does not heed our words, the bad thing happens.
And what's the bad thing, though, Tom? I mean, that becomes just...
We destroy things that he doesn't want destroyed. We hurt his country for committing an act of war against the United States of America. Committing an act of war against the United States of America is a dangerous thing to do. It carries a heavy price.
All right.
We make people pay that price.
All right, Richard, and then I want to go to John Edwards.
I also was going to raise the question. I was very struck by what John Edwards said earlier about the mood in Washington over the day, and I just wanted to ask Senator Edwards where he thinks the administration is going to go in asking Congress. They're going to need new funds, John. They're going to need legislation. Have they indicated to you yet where they're going, and what do you think Congress is prepared to offer to them?
Well, Mr. Ambassador, first of all, we've not heard from the administration yet, and I think understandably so, precisely what they'd like to see us do. I've heard some of the discussion over the course of this program by you and other panelists, and I think you're exactly on the right track. And as I think you and I have already discussed in the past, this issue of terrorism, of course, is the greatest national security threat we face in this country today. There are a number of us who've been working on this issue. We've actually been in the process of drafting legislation aimed at accomplishing a number of things. Number one, establishing terrorism as the kind of national security priority that it should be. Number two, making sure that the federal agencies who are involved in this are adequately and properly coordinated in their activities. Number three, making sure that the institutions who are involved have the authority, the legal authority, to do what needs to be done. I've heard the discussion in this program, and we've talked about in the past, the building of coalitions internationally to deal with this issue, because we're going to need partners around the world to make this process work. But I think the single most important thing is for the American people and our government to recognize what an enormous priority this needs to be. And I have to say, Charlie, and you may have discussed this, and I apologize if you have, but I think the will of the American people will become stronger as we go forward, because they watch this devastation today. But what's going to happen as we move forward through this thing is all of those people who lost their lives and who were injured at the World Trade Center and here at the Pentagon, brave Americans who were totally innocent in this process, this is going to become a very personal thing for the American people. And the American people are going to respond in a strong and personal way. And I think they're going to expect their leadership to do what's necessary to ensure that this sort of thing does not happen again.
All right, let me go to Steve
Senator,
Emerson.
but then what actually are you going to do? I think the American people recognize that this is a threat. We got 10,000 plus dead American citizens. What action are we going to take, sir? What are you going to vote for? What are you going to authorize? What are you going to fund?
Well, I think the starting place is to do the thing. First of all, there's an immediate response to what just occurred, and then there's a long-term issue, which is the issue that I've just been discussing. Long-term, we have the national security threat of ongoing terrorism. There are multiple things that need to be done in connection with that. Those are things
What are you going to do?
Those are the things I just talked about. Putting more resources in our counterterrorism activity, making sure that the things that need to be done are in fact being done, making sure that the federal agencies who are involved are working together, making sure that they have the authority to do what needs to be done.
Senator,
making sure
you're not doing anything. You're just talking. What are we going to do? What action are we going to
Tom,
take?
I think what he is saying is give the people that are responsible for this in the executive branch the resources to do it, is what his answer has been.
And Charlie, if I can add to that, that has to do with the long-term issue. And by the way, I think the building of these coalitions internationally are also a critical component. In addition to that, we have a specific response to these particular instances, which is to identify who did this and go out and hold them responsible.
I've got to bring Steve Emerson in. Steve Emerson, tell me what you know and what you have learned today and what you have heard and what, based on all the things you have known before, what perspective you have on this.
Well, you'll bear with me because I have not been able to listen to what's transpired before in the program, but clearly the lead indications are at this point, based on intelligence assessments, is that there was really only one group led by Osama bin Laden that had the capability, the wherewithal, the motive, and who had evinced publicly his determination to carry the war into the United States. As of June of this year, he made a statement saying, I'm going to take the war into the United States. Number two, there is now an assessment of the cockpit tapes and the transmissions between the pilots and the radar stations on the command stations on the ground. That will help determine what went on during those precious few minutes before the planes were exploded into the Pentagon as well as the World Trade
Steve,
Center.
I'm asking, have you heard anything from sources you might have about any of that today in terms of either statements that bin Laden might have made specifically, even though we have made clear that no one yet has the evidence that connects him to it, that suggests he was saying something specific might happen on this date, etc.?
No, I have no information that he was warning about this particular date itself.
Right.
And remember, I think as Judy said appropriately, this type of operation takes a year, a minimum of a year, maybe 2 years for the reconnaissance, the intelligence, the rehearsal, and to plant the infrastructure on the ground. And I think what the Senator was talking about in terms of giving resources, I think there's going to have to be a lowering of the threshold for collecting intelligence on domestic-based groups, and there's no distinction anymore between domestic and international. They're here on American soil, and they're here in Europe, and they're in Beirut, and they're all over.
Judith Miller.
Well, I think we've been talking about international coalitions, and as General Snee said and Steve said, the importance of intelligence information. I would just point out that the Osama bin Laden networks apparently tried to carry out a huge attack in the United States and Jordan and other countries during the millennium, and that it was Sandy Berger's administration which fortunately helped stop them.
This is the Seattle
Yes,
capture.
Seattle.
Not just Seattle, it was Seattle, Amman, Jordan, and we now know that
This was all, you think, from Osama bin Laden, or you don't know?
Yes, we do know. And we now know that the USS Cole was actually scheduled for contemporaneous action, and the boat that was taking the explosives out to a different ship sunk. So there was a multiple.
Right. But that does beg this question, Sandy, which is, and this has been raised today, how much human intelligence do we have with respect to these groups?
Practically none.
Sorry, Tom, you say what?
Practically none.
Sandy?
Well, because the human intelligence, the director of operations of CIA is the orphan child of the whole intelligence community.
Sandy?
You know, there's going to be a tremendous tendency here to pounce on the intelligence community.
Saying you should have known, you didn't know enough, you don't have any...
when things go beyond the imaginable sometimes, it is easy.
Tom, wait, let come to
it
you.
is easy to get in the blame game here. I think the intelligence community is far more sophisticated about the bin Laden network than they were 2 years ago or 4 years ago. But what today suggests is that there's a heck of a lot we don't know.
Okay, but were you hampered by your inability to do something when you were the national security advisor? And
I think
was there enough urgency to do something?
Yes, certainly, and we did on more than one occasion, as you know. Yeah. But I think the escalation here is going to change the risk calculation for the United States.
Senator Edwards, do you think?
Can I just make one very quick point? We're talking about an intelligence failure. This was not so much an intelligence failure as it was a security failure. All of us who go through these airport security have been led to believe that we had a certain degree of safety. If it had been one plane, perhaps it had been an aberration. But clearly, the people who did this identified a fatal, and I mean fatal in the most dramatic possible sense, a fatal flaw in airport security, and then managed a very sophisticated operation to simultaneously exploit it in at least 4 different planes, and perhaps will continue to. And right now, as we sit here tonight, the American security and intelligence services do not yet know exactly what that flaw they exploited was, which is what makes the administration's decision on when to resume flights and other comparable issues quite tricky.
And how will they find that out?
I would defer to Senator Edwards on the sequence, but I just want to stress that before we beat up on people who are trying very hard to do their jobs in the intelligence field, let's focus on why people are dead tonight. It was a security failure today, not that caused this tragedy, and it was a huge one. There was a flaw in the way people get on airplanes. And how did they get in the cockpits? As General Snee has said, they undoubtedly killed the pilots, because no pilot would take a plane into a building when they could go into the Hudson and Potomac rivers. So something went wrong, and we sit here tonight and we don't know what it was yet.
General Snee?
I would advise other countries to adopt, again, some of the methods that we use in order to have the maximal security
But
in
Tom
air.
Clancy has made the point over and over, which is that when you have somebody who doesn't care whether they live or die, then you have a much more difficult problem.
Then the problem is not to hit the suicide bomber, but those who train him and send him to the mission. And in this, I hope that after this horrible day, the activities of my small country will have more understanding, and we should listen less exhortations about what we are doing.
All right. Well said. Senator Edwards, do you think that there will be an examination, a legitimate, interesting examination now about how this country is in fact vulnerable, whether it's security risk or whether it's an intelligence and the need for more intelligence and need to know more, that will be one of the demands on the Congress, that rather than missile defense, maybe we ought to look at some other areas that deserve equal attention for American vulnerability?
Charlie, I think there will appropriately be a demand from the American people for us to do all of those things. I think that a lot of us have known, including some of your panelists who I've spoken to at length about this before, Dick Holbrook, Sandy Berger, those guys all understand very well that this is the most serious and most imminent threat to our national security that exists. So there are a lot of folks who've known this, and I think what this event does is make it very, very personal to the American people. And I think they're going to appropriately demand that we respond. I just want to reemphasize something, though, that Dick Holbrook said just a minute ago. It would be absolutely the right thing to do, to go in and examine our intelligence gathering activities, where we went, what mistakes we made, how we can do a better job, and what changes we can make. That's something we absolutely, it's imperative that we do that. But the second point, and the point that Dick made just a minute ago, is this breach of security is critical, because without that breach of security, these terrorist activities could not have been executed. And sometimes that gets lost in the process, but the breach of airport security that allowed these events to take place is a critical component in this.
But let me just add one thing, that I agree that breach of security must be analyzed, and we've got to go through all the steps in trying to plug up the holes. But the bottom line is, we have to recognize that the United States faces an implacable militant foe in the world today, and it's not just located in Afghanistan by bin Laden. He's got cells all over. This is an international organization that has an incredible amount of capabilities. It's Islamic fundamentalists. They hate the United States.
Well, not all Islamic fundamentalists.
Well, I would say all militant Islamic fundamentalists. The degree of celebrations you see in the West Bank today and in Lebanon today by people celebrating this
Coming
attack.
to you, Tom.
I think it clearly shows that there is a major threat, and that we have to not just flagellate ourselves and criticize ourselves for the intelligence failure, to the extent that it was one, but really go after the enemy that carried this out.
I mean, I would point out that the armed forces of the United States and many of our military bases and facilities, embassies, have been on alert since June, precisely because the U.S. government had intelligence information that a major terrorist attack was being planned.
What is qualitatively different here, and I agree with Judy, and we've closed embassies repeatedly, is an operation conducted within the United States. Exactly. Obviously going on within the United States for weeks undetected.
All right. Let me go to Tom Clancy, one final remark. Tom, what would you like to see the United States do? And I think you have said it well, which is identify who did this and go do something about it. As the President said earlier, punish them.
The first line of defense against terrorism is good intelligence information. Senator Edwards, one thing we got to do is beef up the operations directorate of CIA. That's an agency of 20,000 people, of whom maybe 800 are field intelligence officers. The mission here to infiltrate and find out about these terrorist organizations, essentially what the FBI did when they sneaked Joe Pistone into the mafia under the name of Donnie Brasco. You infiltrate and you learn what they're up to, and then you break them up.
All right.
You got to have field spooks. We don't have enough.
I got less than a minute, Tom. You expected to get strong international support along the lines we've talked about earlier here.
Anybody who doesn't support us is in for
Thank you, Tom. I'll be right back.
Yeah.
Senator Ambassador Holbrook.
Yes.
They'll be responsive to this event.
I think you're going to see an enormous set of consequential actions stemming from this, and if the United States shows the leadership that we can show, should show, must show, we will get support, but not 100%. There are going to be some people in the Mideast, some of Israel's neighbors, who are going to not come all the way. But,
of course, ultimately, they will be consumed by the same forces of militancy unless they stand up.
And both Egypt and Saudi Arabia are afraid of just what Sandy's talking about.
Egypt and Saudi Arabia.
Sure, that they'll get overwhelmed.
They'll be consumed by the same forces that were on attack here. Sure. Senator Edwards, do you expect some kind of sense of the Senate to come out tomorrow or the next day?
Oh, I think by the end of the day tomorrow, Charlie, there will be a very strong resolution passed by the Congress.
Saying what in 25 seconds?
Saying basically that we universally condemn what occurred and that we're prepared to take action necessary to prevent it from occurring again.
The resolution of the Senate, the Congress, the American people across the board.
That's exactly right.
Thank you all. I thank you for coming in for this live program from New York and from Washington and from Arkansas, looking at this day that people have declared an act of war against the United States. Thank you.